According to the official story, Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone killer of John Kennedy. Oswald told police and reporters he was a patsy. Before his story could be verified, Oswald met a man inside the Dallas police station.
He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot.
Now, the story you didn't hear in Dallas.
Can't see who has been hit, if anybody's been hit, but apparently something is wrong here. Something is terribly wrong.
You'll meet a beautiful spy.
They wanted me to kill him. They said if I didn't kill him, that they'd have to go to war because he was turning communist and he was evil, and this non-stop brainwashing, pure brainwashing, I could call that. You know, when you're young, dumb, vulnerable, 18, and already wounded with no parents to guide you or help you, or they were just there day and night.
A crusading DA.
John Kennedy was killed because he refused to send combat troops to Vietnam.
And a dangerous woman who claimed Lee Harvey Oswald did not act alone, according to everyone that she was talking to in Mark Lane.
She met with me and she said, I'm going to break open the Kennedy assassination. I said, you are wonderful. And she said, don't smile, I'm going to really do it. I'm going to devote all of my energy to this.
Conspiracy theories or facts?
Mark Lane I think, is the pioneer for the conspiracy theories, and certainly is the reason that America started to change its mind. He has been a persistent critic of the government's position. I just happen to think that he's wrong on almost every position in his book.
Most people continue to have doubts, and those doubts will remain because of Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby denied the world the trial of Lee Harvey Oswald. New Orleans is a city known for its Cajun cuisine and Mardi Gras madness, a kind of Dixieland decadence known only to Bourbon Street. But it's also a city where mafia history looms as large as the Mississippi, led for decades by a man known as Carlos Marcello. And many here think it was Marcello and the mob that murdered JFK. Is there a New Orleans connection to that deadly day in Dallas?
Because Bobby Kennedy had targeted Carlos Marcello.
John Davis, a cousin of Jacqueline Kennedy, wrote the book Mafia Kingfish. He believes that Robert Kennedy's crusade against Marcello and other mafia bosses backfired in a big way on November 22nd, 1963.
Marcello was known to have sworn vengeance against the Kennedys on at least 3 occasions.
Marcello was no mere mobster. He ruled a $2 billion a year criminal empire and was believed to be the most politically powerful crime boss in the country, with connections ranging all the way to Washington.
And it was sort of an absolute monarchy with Carlos Marcello, the boss, the supreme boss.
But Marcello's reign was threatened in the late 50s when Robert Kennedy turned up the heat. First as counsel to a Senate committee investigating organized crime, then as Attorney General. Bobby Kennedy had his sights set on the mob.
Bobby Kennedy, when he took over as Attorney General, told an associate, I want to be known as the guy who broke the mafia. And they really meant business.
Kennedy's war on the mob made national news when he grilled Teamsters boss Jimmy Hoffa at the Senate hearings.
And I just don't recall.
Can't remember what you talked about, and you can't remember whether he was in your room.
Wouldn't have been of anything of any importance, Mr. Kennedy, and I can't recall it.
And when Marcello was called to testify, he reportedly infuriated Robert Kennedy by taking the fifth 51 times. Kennedy retaliated, Davis says, by having Marcello deported on an immigration violation. But Marcello came back, and it was then, Davis believes, that he plotted his revenge.
He outlined a plan to kill President Kennedy in order to neutralize his brother Bobby, who was making his life hell.
For such a plan to work, the mob would need the right players.
He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot.
Item. It's long been thought that Ruby may have been on a mission from the mob to silence Oswald. Item: 15 years after the Warren Commission announced that Oswald had acted alone, the House Assassinations Committee said there was a 95% probability of a conspiracy. And it pointed out that Marcello had the motive, means, and the opportunity.
I think, though, that if I had been Mr. Marcello and I was mad at somebody, it wouldn't have been the president I shot, it would have been his brother. His brother was the one who was trying to deport him and who stayed on him like butter on bread.
Not all New Orleans buy the Marcello murder theory. Rosemary James is a former reporter who covered Marcello.
The suggestion that he killed the president for that reason, I think, is a little strong.
If you want to kill the dog, you don't chop off its tail, which would be Bobby Kennedy, I suppose. You cut the head off, and then the dog dies, tail and all.
Jim Garrison, the New Orleans district attorney, never believed organized crime was behind the Kennedy killing. He had his own theories, and it didn't bother him, he said, to be a lonely voice.
First of all, let me remind you of the old saying that one man with the truth constitutes a majority.
He said he'd uncovered evidence of deep conspiracy in the murder of John Kennedy, a conspiracy that was at the highest levels of the American government. Garrison's last theory was that the conspiracy had been directed by national intelligence agencies, angered by Kennedy's policies in Southeast Asia.
John Kennedy was killed because he refused to send combat troops to Vietnam.
Aside from Oswald, Garrison charged 2 New Orleans residents with being involved, David Ferry and Clay Shaw. Shaw was a high-profile businessman who Garrison claimed worked for the CIA. But by the time Garrison went to trial, Ferry was dead, and from the start, his case against Shaw seemed shaky. There were witnesses who said they had seen Shaw conspire with Ferry and Oswald to kill Kennedy, but their reliability was highly questionable. One witness, Charles Spiesel. Garrison describes one of Spiesel's experiences on the witness stand.
The defense counsel said, in effect, now, Mr. Spiesel, isn't it a fact that your daughter goes to LSU? And he said, yes. And he said, Mr. Spiesel, isn't it a fact that when she leaves, every year when she leaves for LSU, before she leaves, you take her fingerprints? Oh, yes, I do. And isn't it a fact, Mr. Spiesel, when she gets back, you take her fingerprints again? Oh, yes, I take her fingerprints when she gets back. And he says, why do you do that? He says, well, I want to compare them and make sure she's the same girl I sent to LSU.
Perhaps not surprisingly, the jury returned a verdict in favor of Clay Shaw after just 1 hour of deliberation. But Garrison claims that 2 jurors were leaning toward conviction and that others believed in part of the case.
The other 10, as you probably know, concluded that we had shown that there was a conspiracy to kill John Kennedy, but that we hadn't been unable to completely prove a reason for Shaw's participation beyond a reasonable doubt.
Shaw's life was ravaged by the trial and its aftermath. He died in 1974, a broken man, but Garrison has never wavered from his belief that the trial was necessary and that his basic conspiracy theory is correct.
It was in New Orleans that it was found that the murder of John Kennedy was faked and the United States government was involved in the murder, and that we were right about it.
Jim Garrison and the New Orleans connection does not impress this man, Gerald Posner. Posner's a skeptic and an investigative writer with strong opinions that he says are backed up with facts in a book called Case Closed.
This is Oswald absolutely enjoying the moment. Oswald, he didn't want to be captured, but once captured, he's going to make everybody go through it. He's going to make them work that weekend, and he's going to make them believe that he had nothing to do with it and put the whole world through knowing who he is. I'm furious with him. He's the man with blood on his hands who today is considered an innocent patsy. He got away with it as far as history is concerned, and he got his wish. We're still talking about him 30 years later. Absolutely no question. 100% I put my professional reputation on the line. That's the man that killed Jack Kennedy, not as part of any conspiracy.
We had Posner screen some rare videotape. On parts of it, he listened to the story of this woman, Morita Lorenz. She was Fidel Castro's mistress.
Too many bases, mob, FBI, CIA. You never know if a bullet flies your way or a 22 comes through the window. Who is the culprit.
Marita Lorenz tells a fascinating story. It's one that I just happen to think is absolutely wrong. I spoke to the investigators who dealt with her for hundreds of hours in the government. They tell me on the record she led them down so many paths that were dead ends. She's just not credible on the assassination. Oh, it's a dramatic story. There's no wonder. She was Castro's mistress. I believe that's true. What's difficult to tell with Marita is what's real and what's not real. Sifting that out will give you plenty of gray hairs.
They sent her to Cuba, kill Fidel?
She says she was a CIA operative, so that's her claim.
She met Ozzy, she said?
Met Oswald, knew Jack Ruby, took a cross-country trip with Jack Ruby. It's absolutely fascinating. You couldn't write material as good as this if you wanted to. I just happen to think that there's not a shred of it that's accurate.
Born in 1940 to German parents, Marita never led what you would call a typical life. Her father was a Commodore in the German Navy, and much of her childhood was spent traveling the world. It was aboard his luxury liner that she met and later fell in love with Fidel Castro.
It was an intense love affair. He was loving. I know a lot of people won't like that. He was interesting. He wasn't the average boy around the corner. He was the dictator, prime minister of Cuba.
It was her passionate affair with a new prime minister that would lead Marita, now pregnant with Castro's child, into the world of international espionage.
One day, the head of security for the Cuban Air Force, a man named Francisco Fiorini, called upon Marita and said, I just came from a meeting. Fidel is planning to murder you and the baby. You're an embarrassment. His real name was not Francisco Fiorini. His real name was Frank Sturgis. He was an operative for the Central Intelligence Agency.
Frank Sturgis was a shadowy contact operative for the CIA working in Cuba. But was he attempting to save Marita? Or was his story intended to build Marita's hatred for the man many feared was forming an alliance with the Soviet Union?
They wanted me to kill him. They said if I didn't kill him, that they'd have to go to war because he was turning communist, and he was evil, and this non-stop brainwashing, pure brainwashing, I could call that. You know, when you're young, dumb, vulnerable, 18, and already wounded with no parents to guide you or help you, or they were just there day and night.
Marita's mission to kill Castro would fail.
Somehow he knew, and he pulled out his 45. He said, okay, you do it. Come on. Go ahead. Mata me. You know?
Kill me.
Kill me. I said, I could, you know. I could. And he said, oh, yes, you could, but you won't, because nobody will kill me.
Castro was right. She couldn't do it. He could have killed her, but did not. He allowed Marita to flee to Miami, where Sturgis then trained her as part of a group called Operation 40.
Every United States president has a group of bad boys. I was the only girl. It's a group of trained assassins that just do very high-priority assassinations.
Their mission was to invade Cuba and eliminate Castro, but President Kennedy refused to supply them with adequate air support. So many opposed to Castro blamed Kennedy for the failed Bay of Pigs invasion.
They hated him for lack of air cover for the Bay of Pigs invasion. That was one thing. They hated him because he was catering to the minority races, the blacks, right? And for Vietnam. All I heard was hate, hate, hate.
It was only after that fateful trip to Dallas with Sturgis and a man she'd come to know as Ozzy that Marita says she realized just how deep that hatred ran.
Ozzy, the one I recognized after Kennedy was shot. He was with us in the Bay of Pigs training camps. I really didn't know him that well. He was a part of that Sturgis group.
Ozzy, of course, was Lee Harvey Oswald. Marita later was to claim that she left Oswald, Jack Ruby, CIA Station Chief E. Howard Hunt, and Frank Sturgis together in a Dallas hotel room with rifles and maps 24 hours before the infamous moment. That startling claim led her to being called before the House Committee on Assassinations. Testimony she claims Frank Sturgis warned her not to give.
He said, you know the consequences if you talk.
I had received an anonymous phone call that Sturgis was coming in town to kill Marita.
Jimmy Rothstein, then a New York Police Department intelligence detective, followed up on the tip. He arrested Sturgis inside Marita's apartment, allegedly attempting to make good on his threat. But the mysterious CIA man was not easily kept behind bars.
After we arrested him, he was entitled to a phone call, and I made that call myself, which was to Gaetan Fonzie.
Gaetan Fonzie was the investigator for the House Committee on Assassinations. It seemed a strange call for him to make, but in the tangled web of the CIA, things are seldom what they seem. The call got Sturgis released. Still, Marita decided to testify.
I gave them what I had. Group photographs. Everything I wrote was crossed out, marked out, put in parentheses, and they totally altered it.
Now, years after she began her career as a spy, Marita must constantly look over her shoulder for the men for whom she once worked.
No question about that. Can't argue with Marita on that. That she's right on. Kennedy had a lot of enemies. Mob hated him. Anti-Castro Cubans hated him. Whole host of people. CIA hated him. A lot of people may have been plotting to kill him. I don't deny that. All I'm saying is Oswald wasn't part of the plot.
Within days of the Kennedy murder, a young New York lawyer, Mark Lane, was in Dallas interviewing witnesses. He did not like what he was hearing.
Where were you employed on November 22nd, 1963?
At that time, I was employed as a tower operator for the Union Terminal Company.
At 12:30 on November 22nd, Lee Bowers was here in this railroad tower. From the window, he could see the motorcade's progress, and he had an unobstructed view of the wooden fence atop the grassy knoll. After the assassination, Bowers tried to tell the Warren Commission what he saw that day. But like many other witnesses, he was cut off. However, in this 1966 interview with Mark Lane, he was able to finish part of what he had begun to say.
There was some unusual occurrence, a flash of light or smoke or something, which caused me to feel like something out of the ordinary had occurred there.
On a railroad overpass adjacent to the grassy knoll stood a number of train workers whose testimony confirmed Bowers' observations.
Well, we all four seen about the same thing.
At the time, I didn't know what it was, but it sounded like a loud firecracker or a gunshot. And it sounded like it came from the left and in front of us, towards the wooden fence. And there was a puff of smoke that came underneath the trees.
Is there any doubt in your mind that that shot came from behind the fence?
There's no doubt in my mind.
The Warren Commission concluded Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots, all from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. But Robert Groden, co-author of the bestseller High Treason and the photographic consultant to the House Assassination Committee, is one of many who disagree.
We have the ear witnesses. We have the medical evidence. It's all consistent. Every bit of evidence in every field shows that at least 2 shots came from the right front, from the area of the stockade fence.
4 months after this interview was filmed, Lee Bowers died or was killed in broad daylight on this remote Texas highway.
Lee Bowers was heading west here on Highway 67, heading from Midlothian down to Cleburne. And according to an eyewitness, he was driven off the road by a black car. He was talking to the ambulance people and told them that he felt he had been drugged when he stopped for coffee back there a few miles in Midlothian.
But why would Lee Bowers have been killed when it seemed he had already told all he knew? Walter Rochelle was a friend of Lee's and of his late brother Monty. Rochelle says Lee Bowers was afraid to tell all he witnessed during the assassination. However, Rochelle revealed the full story to us in an exclusive interview in Dealey Plaza.
He said he saw a car pull up. 2 men get out of the car, and they were carrying what appeared to be rifles. He said that one gunman apparently positioned himself either on their car or on a car. The other one, I don't recall where he said he was. He said he saw both men fire shots. He could tell by the smoke, the puffs of smoke that came from the rifles.
You're saying that Lee Bowers told you that he saw both men fire?
Yes, he did.
In addition, Texas journalist Ben Jones, one of the first to challenge the official view, says he heard the complete Bowers story.
He is the man who said he saw gunmen firing at the president from their hidden positions. He didn't see all of them, but he saw 2 of them. that were firing at the president.
Another witness who wasn't questioned by the Warren Commission, a deaf mute, Ed Hoffman, said he observed two men behind the fence and saw at least one shot fired. Further acoustics tests conducted by the House Assassinations Committee determined that at least one shot was almost certainly fired from the knoll. So why was Bowers so afraid to tell the full story?
Lee had disappeared for about 2 days, one night I know for sure, which is very uncharacteristic of him. And when he came back, one of his fingers was missing on one of his hands. So Lee gave Monty some excuse for what had happened, which Monty didn't accept, so he called the local hospitals, the clinics, and some doctors' offices, and there was no record of anyone, and certainly not Lee, going in and having that taken care of.
Shortly after this alleged disappearance and mysterious maiming, Lee Bowers died in that suspicious automobile wreck.
At the time I was in Monty's office, he was quite upset because the insurance company had refused to pay the claim. I can't recall too vividly, but I believe that Monty felt that the insurance company did not believe that his death was accidental.
Within 3 years of Kennedy's funeral, at least 18 important witnesses had died or were killed against almost impossible odds.
Do you think that certain witnesses or certain people that know more about the Kennedy assassination have been?
Well, definitely so. I don't know exactly the number of people who have died, but I think it's already, we have something like 20 people who have died.
George de Morishelt was a suspected CIA operative and was a close friend of Lee Harvey Oswald. He could not have known when he answered a Dutch journalist's question that his name would be one day added to the list of the dead, but he might have suspected it. In 1977, summoned to testify before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, but just before his scheduled appearance, he was killed by a shotgun blast in Florida. Attorney Mark Lane is a well-known assassination investigator whose most recent book on the case is Plausible Denial. He flew to Florida to challenge the DA on the official verdict of suicide.
And he said, Mr. Lane, you must know by now, there are forces here bigger than you and bigger than me. I'm saying suicide.
Whoever was responsible, shadowy characters like George de Morishelt were not the only people dying mysteriously.
To my left, ladies and gentlemen, a very lovely and charming young lady who's one of my favorite columnists and whom I had the pleasure of knowing for many years, Miss Dorothy Kilgallen.
In the early 60s, Dorothy Kilgallen, a nationally known gossip columnist and a panelist on the popular TV show What's My Line, was another one. She had led a glamorous life. She was married to Richard Comar, and when she had an affair, it was with Johnny Ray.
You're gonna miss your loving daddy from now on.
More about Johnny Ray later. Dorothy Kilgallen seemed an unlikely person to expose the secrets surrounding JFK's death, but soon after the assassination, she began to do just that, according to everyone that she was talking to and Mark Lane.
She met with me and she said, I'm going to break open the Kennedy assassination. I said, you are wonderful. And she said, don't smile, I'm going to really do it. I'm going to devote all of my energy to this.
Dorothy Kilgallen began to break one important story after another. In March 1964, she scored the ultimate big scoop, an interview with Jack Ruby. It was something no other journalist was able to accomplish. Now we've learned that Kilgallen's link to Ruby was probably Johnny Ray. Official sources tell us that Ruby and Ray, both bisexuals, knew one another from the country's gay underground.
She interviewed Jack Ruby in Dallas. She spent 8 minutes with him alone, at his behest, and she was following clues, following a trail consequent to whatever it is that Ruby told her.
And Kilgallen followed the trail all over the country. In the fall of 1965, Mark Lane got a telephone call.
She said, I have it. I have it. I know what it is, and I'm going to bring it back. And as soon as I bring it back, I want to share it with you. This evidence. And I have no idea what she was talking about, what the evidence was.
Lane never got a chance to ask again. Following a late-night meeting with an unknown stranger, Dorothy Kilgallen was found dead of a massive overdose of sleeping pills and alcohol. Many suspected murder. But Dr. Michael Baden, who was present at the autopsy, disagrees.
I can say that it is almost impossible to force a person to swallow that many pills in a homicidal. It's not a way you can kill somebody readily.
Critics say we can never be sure one way or the other because the police made no effort to find the truth. Others believe that the authorities tampered with the death scene.
They talked to no one. They interviewed no witnesses. They made no attempt to determine the circumstances around her death the night before. The autopsy report, all the official explanations are just riddled with lies.
With Dorothy gone, a prominent voice was silenced. Perhaps more tragically, she never told what it was she knew.
After I heard that she died, I went to see Mr. Colmar and expressed my regrets and condolences about her death and said, did she bring anything back? And he said, yes, some papers which she thought apparently were very, very important. And I said, I think maybe she would like me to look at them. He said, I've destroyed them. Enough people have died as a result of this investigation, and I'm putting an end to it now.
Mark Lane I think is the pioneer for the conspiracy theories, and certainly is the reason that America started to change its mind. He has been a persistent critic of the government's position. I just happen to think that he's wrong on almost every position in his books.
One man with a close-up view of the JFK killing was this doctor, Charles Crenshaw. On that day in Dallas, Crenshaw was a young intern. He never forgot what he saw.
The first thing was really the president lying there, but to the left with Jacqueline Kennedy. And there she was in that famous pink suit. Her whole right side was caked with blood. I looked at her and I thought, here's a lady who, in just my own thoughts, she had anger or hatred. She also had disbelief. And also she was, I could see despair. And finally, with her thoughts, she thought he was dead. He had no blood pressure. He barely had a pulse, possibly, and he was breathing occasionally.
The doctors saw Kennedy's wounds minutes after the shooting.
The drama of his head wound, the head wound was in the parietal occipital area and part of the temple. It was a huge, blown-out hole.
The bullet wound entered here and traveled back, plowing
right
through.
Mm-hmm. The hairline here, it went in on the right, coming down here, coming across, and that's the reason that huge plowed-out area was present and the cerebellum was there. If the bullet had entered from the back, it would have totally removed the cerebellum and gone forward.
What you're saying runs contrary to the findings of the Warren Commission, runs contrary to our official version of what happened to President Kennedy.
Oh, yeah. I am aware of this very well because it took me 29 years to effectively say or to do and expose my observations in the face of fraternal doctrine, fear, naivety.
What were you afraid of?
What I was really afraid of was my career-mindedness.
You were a young man. You were a resident?
30 years old.
30 years old. Your mind must have been reeling at this point. Here was your president. You were trying to save his life. What was going through your mind?
The basic point is it was such a shock. But we treated this every day there at Parkland. So we all almost knew our roles. It was a team approach to resuscitate the patient.
And this patient
However,
just happened
this
to be...
patient was the president.
And you were never questioned?
No, not at all. They did not even do a research project enough to find out who all was in the room. Only those people who wrote up their comments or what they saw were called for the Warren Commission.
And you, being a young doctor, decided not to write up your comments?
I didn't like the way the project was being handled. And afterwards, when everybody in Dallas knew it was Lee Harvey Oswald, and I didn't think so, I was not going to rock the boat. If I had gone against all the other people the Warren Commission and created this bomb, I'd have been a pariah of our medical community. I could have lost my job. Dr. Baxter and I walked there, and she stood up immediately. And he said, "Mrs. Kennedy, I'm afraid your husband is dead." And I put my arm around her, and she had long, huge shoulders. She was almost my height. So she sat back down again. And that was when I saw, still in that little purse, some brain tissue. And I called her aide, the man that was standing there next to her, aside, and I said, "Please clean this off." And also hid the head wound and the tracheostomy wound. So the sheet was a little short for him. His toes were sticking out. And so as Ms. Kennedy came in, she touched the cart, the gurney, and kissed his great toe, and then proceeded to go forward up to the head and to stand there holding his right hand while the priest gave him the last rite. And then, as a thought, after all this was over, she took her wedding ring and placed this on his little finger. And that was her time, I guess, and her present to him.
The official medical examiner's report from Washington rejects the doctor's observations.
That was one of the biggest things that happened at Parkland. That's what caused all of this, not allowing Texas law to be in place. Our pathologist should have done the autopsy at Parkland, and he tried to follow the Texas law. And the Secret Service, they looked like a herd of locusts, a phalanx around the coffin. And Mrs. Kennedy was in the middle with her left hand on the casket. And they were then coming out into the hall. And all of a sudden, there, our forensic pathologist stopped them. Dr. Earl Rose said, "Halt. This man has to have an autopsy here in the state of Texas. It'll only take 45 minutes." And they would not hear of it. They wanted to get that body out of Dallas.
2:15 p.m. Dallas. The body of the slain president was loaded onto Air Force One. Minutes later, Lyndon B. Johnson took the oath of office with Jacqueline Kennedy by his side.
solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
5:58 p.m., Andrews Air Force Base, Washington. The casket is unloaded for the trip to Bethesda Naval Hospital, where a team of doctors and pathologists will perform the official autopsy.
When I viewed the autopsy pictures, they had the frontal part of the cerebrum here and the skull out.
So when the picture was taken, you think they pulled the skin back up over this wound?
That's the only thing I can postulate, because the back of his head was gone. This was a huge hole. Because on the right, it was 9 to 10 centimeters across, and you could look right into the brain.
Crenshaw says the autopsy photos of the president's wounds are visibly different from the wounds he had witnessed firsthand.
But something had happened between Parkland and Bethesda, Maryland.
So we're talking about the destruction of evidence, because
yes, definitely.
This is a very serious charge that you're making. Why do you think you would have gotten in trouble for having revealed this information then?
Let's put it this way. Anyone in 1963 that had any other opinion other than the official opinion was going against the stream. Even that night of November the 22nd, and definitely on the 23rd, everybody knew there was one shooter.
Lee Harvey Oswald, a 24-year-old school book depository employee, had been arrested at the Texas Theater shortly after the shooting in Dealey Plaza. He was taken into custody and placed in a cell at police headquarters. With the suspected assassin behind bars, Dr. Crenshaw went home briefly on Friday night.
Coming to work that morning, that Saturday morning, even though it was early and still dark There were people all over the place. It was like a fair.
Crenshaw stayed the night at Parkland, wakening at 6 a.m. Sunday morning to make the rounds. Meanwhile, across town, preparations for Oswald's transfer to the county jail were underway. He had been interrogated 5 times, but had never confessed.
I didn't shoot anybody, sir.
I think this is the man that killed the president.
Law enforcement officials never got the chance to try Oswald for the terrible crime of which he was accused. That morning, in the basement of the Dallas police station, Jack Ruby became Oswald's one-man judge, jury, and executioner.
Anything to say in your defense? Oswald has been shot.
For the second time in 3 days, a man on the edge of death was delivered into the hands of Dr. Charles Crenshaw and the Parkland trauma team.
When Lee Harvey Oswald came in, all of us wanted to save this guy because we had trained so hard.
Now, during all this, you received a phone call.
I went to the operating supervisor's office, Audrey Bell, and I picked up the phone. And then all of a sudden, this voice like God comes across. This is the president, Lyndon B. Johnson. He said, "How is the accused assassin doing?" I said, "Well, he's holding his own. He's critical. He's lost a great amount of blood. We hope we can save him." He said, "I want a deathbed statement from the assassin." And all of a sudden, the line was broken.
Oswald never made a deathbed statement. Crenshaw, like the rest of us, was left with only questions. There is no more vivid demonstration of how haunted we are as a nation by this murder than the steady stream of people who visit Dealey Plaza every day, rain or shine, trying to work out the 20th century's most confounding mysteries for themselves. For Dr. Charles Crenshaw, Dealey Plaza had its own intimate significance.
Only that he was in the front, and this is the place where more witnesses, for a fact, saw a gunman here and a puff of smoke.
So where exactly would that be?
Right here, behind this fence.
Eyewitnesses did report that shots were fired from over the fence on the grassy knoll, and most conspiracy theorists agree with Crenshaw and the eyewitness accounts that the fatal shots did come from the front.
What really gets to me is whoever concocted this horrible crime has never let the American people know because it's been covered up so well.
Have you ever before or are you even now concerned about your own safety?
Well, I'm well aware that a number of people who have been close to or around the assassination have lost their lives. But I would hope now that now we can only have the truth and we wouldn't have to fear. You can always think about it. When you walk into an emergency room and you see someone, a victim of trauma, blood, your mind will always revert back to that. That was the high point of my life in surgery. I'd trained all my life to do surgery. And the most important patient of my life, all of us, couldn't save.
For investigative reporter Gerald Posner, the doctor's story is heartfelt, but not supportive of a conspiracy theory. He says one man alone killed JFK.
Dr. Crenshaw is well-intentioned. He believes what he says is true, but I'm convinced he's mistaken. I've spoken to the 8 principal doctors who treated Kennedy at Parkland. On the record, Dr. Crenshaw is just wrong in his observations. All the people said Grassy Knoll, many of them are mistaken at the time. Go back to the day of the assassination, and nobody says Grassy Knoll. So they identify 6 witnesses, pick a gunman at Dealey, and they only pick the southeast corner of the depository. Many of the witnesses who now say I saw a gunman at the Grassy Knoll have come out 15 and 20 years later, and in some instances, they weren't even at Dealey Plaza.
Mark Lane?
Mark Lane I think is the pioneer for the conspiracy theories, and certainly is the reason that America started to change its mind. He has been a persistent critic of the government's position. I just happen to think that he's wrong on almost every position in his books.
For Posner, the case is closed. One lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, killed JFK. It's the official view, but he's in the minority. Most people continue to have doubts, and those doubts will remain because of Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby denied the world the trial of Lee Harvey Oswald. Detective Jim Lavelle was handcuffed to Oswald on that fateful day. We asked him to return with us to the scene of the crime, the exact spot where Oswald was shot.
Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Ruby standing with the gun by his side. And about the same time I saw it and recognized it, he made two quick steps. How? It took about a second and a half or less for him to make that move, and fired one shot.
It was the world's first live televised execution. Millions watched as Jack Ruby pumped a bullet into Oswald's stomach. The press called the 52-year-old nightclub operator a tough guy, a loner.
He and I were very close, the two closest members of the family to each other.
He was energetic, he's always active, and he always involved us in ways to make money.
Jack Ruby was somebody who was always on the make. He was eager to impress people. A lot of this was very superficial. There seemed to be not a great deal of depth to the individual.
His job was being in organized crime. His personality, he was a little bit of an eccentric kind of a character.
Jack Ruby grew up in the mean streets of Chicago's West Side. That's where he got his nickname, and according to experts, an early introduction to the Mafia.
Sparky went back to the days in Chicago when he was running envelopes for the Al Capone gang at $1 an envelope.
He moved in mob circles, but he was gregarious. So in the circles he moved, he seems to have met many of the mob luminaries.
But Ruby's relatives deny their brother was ever married to the mob.
I think if you ask Vito Genovese's family the same question, you would get the same answer. There's no dispute that Jack Ruby was an organized crime figure.
David Scheim, author of Contract on America, The Mafia Murder of JFK, says the Warren Commission simply chose to ignore Ruby's underworld connection.
It's fairly clear that Ruby, the mobster, killed Oswald in his line of business.
Seath Cantor worked for a Dallas newspaper. He knew Jack Ruby personally, and he describes him as a man about town. He played host to members of the Dallas police force, as well as organized crime figures in the notorious strip joint he owned.
People come into the club for entertainment, and probably you have to be nice to those kind of people. You don't want to have them for an enemy.
Ruby was used as a police informant. He had easy access to headquarters, even attended a briefing on the day Kennedy was killed, at which Oswald was presented to the press.
Ruby's movements through the weekend were very purposeful.
But Ruby's brother Earl says Jack's murder of Oswald was a spur-of-the-moment decision.
Oswald was wearing a smile and a snicker, and it just ticked Jack off because he was a highly impulsive person to begin with. And he hated Oswald in addition to that because he really loved Kennedy.
Ruby was convicted of murdering Oswald, sentenced to die in the electric chair.
The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
That rare film of Jack Ruby is 30 years old and hard to hear. We want you to listen closely. Ruby is saying, the world will never know the true facts.
The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
Ruby spent his last days in a jail cell, ironically overlooking Dealey Plaza. And although his conviction was overturned, he died of cancer in 1967 before a new trial could be held. JFK, victim of a conspiracy or dead at the hands of a lone gunman? You decide.